Yeah.
I used to know how, but it's been, gosh, I don't think I
Because
set it up
I just
since
checked my laptop 10 minutes ago, and there was Tom's download for today. Like,
Recording in progress.
can't do it. Okay.
Right.
Well, we may as well get started, right? We're okay with that?
Glenn's coming, isn't he? Maybe not. No, he told me he's coming.
Oh,
Hold on.
well, he's got 2 minutes. I'm jumping the gun.
I just like to get everything done. No, I agree. No, 'cause
And I will be in person at our next meeting, but
Awesome.
yeah,
couldn't rearrange the schedule for this one, so.
So the planning
No
commission
problem.
meeting will be in the Rollins Center
Next week.
next week.
So don't come here, go to the Rollins Center, please.
With the general public, or are they remote?
Both.
It's their choice.
First come, first serve?
It's like today's meeting.
Yep. But what did we figure out? We can fit around
40?
40 seated participants.
Okay.
Yep.
Oh, gosh, you're,
If they still work, I don't know if they are.
one of them does. The other doesn't.
Oh, I should have given them to Janelle.
Yeah. It's good with you now.
Put it in the planner mobile.
Oh, my God.
I share that now.
Feel the stick.
I share it with
Planner and Parks.
Parks and Rec Mobile. It's the P&P
Nice to
Mobile,
keep liquids
Planning and
out.
Parks.
Yeah. Helps.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't need this anymore.
All right, well, I'm gonna wait on
Bailey looks like a Domino's logo, though.
Okay.
If you're not busy afterwards,
Now I'm gonna be getting hungry every time.
Oh, how do I share the PowerPoint presentation? It's the only thing I haven't done.
It doesn't work. It doesn't, for some reason, this is supposed to do that, but it's not. It's supposed to show it's on the computer. So I'm sure that it's just that something's not tight somewhere.
Okay, I'll play with it,
But
I can at least share it on Zoom.
Yeah, I was gonna have, yeah, that's what we did the other night, and then we did this.
Yeah. When we get there.
Speaking of zooming, yeah.
Just say hi to everybody on Zoom and YouTube.
So.
All right.
And
So, yeah, I'll be here.
Okay, great.
Got it done.
Here comes Glenn.
Here comes Glenn.
Here we go.
Somehow we lost Nancy, but she's here.
Okay.
You just can't.
I'm here, I'm here.
You just can't see her, but she's here.
We don't accuse you of being late, I don't know what reason.
She's right on time, like all attorneys are.
You can change it to,
Maybe, yeah.
because we were putting it on street review the
How are
other
you?
night.
Hey, Tom, what's going on, bud?
Gallery.
See you.
She might have turned
Before
off-
you guys go on camera.
Hi, Glenn.
How you doing, Tom?
Good.
I've shaken your hand before.
Chat.
I shook it the other night. Always good to see you, Tom.
see.
You can run it
From there,
Yeah.
not
You're
from
gonna sit
here.
over there in case a third person shows up.
All right, well, are we ready to get started? All right, I'll call this meeting to order. The Chapter 170 Task Force is now in session. Oh,
Nope, talk into it.
sorry, been a while since I've been back to being mic'd up. So Chapter 170 Task Force, ready to get started. Did you have a presentation? Did I see up?
Tom has put together a PowerPoint presentation. I can bring it up, and Tom, do you want to start with that and go through it?
Yeah, I have just some overview, and then I'll dive into that.
All right, thank you very
Okay,
much.
so go with the overview.
Great. So I thought the overview, what I could do is just catch everybody up on what we've been doing and where we're at with a lot of the activities. Basically, so we're working on 170, and we've talked a lot in the past about process refinements and standards and guidelines. So Janelle and Charlie and I have been sharing some information back and forth on that and working on it. So what we'll do is present some of that later on, but I just wanted to go through some of the high points of things that we've been doing. So we've completed, in my mind, the overview of the process we've heard from the subcommittee of conceptually, here's the process we want to go with. And now we're working on ordinance language to back that up. So there's still time to tweak that and work on it, but we need to wrap our heads around it and figure out how to make the code say what our flow charts say. So that's a little bit of a task. And with something as complicated as an ordinance, there's unintended things you have to check on and make sure they cross-reference correctly and all that, those fun activities. It's the same with the standards, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. We've also shared, as the Planning Commission, when you briefed them at their last meeting, said we should contact the city solicitor. So we've sent some material to Glenn and just about conceptually what's the process, how it would change. The other big thing was the standards, if we can have a design guideline book separately from it. So Glenn's still, I guess, taking a look at that, and we'll hear back from him at some point, and we can talk about it further. But that's, I think, a really good way to go about it, is to, even when we, now that we have some of our ideas on paper, it's good to share them with other experts, and I'll talk about a little bit more of that. So we're currently refining the draft language in the ordinance and the drafting design standards. That's what we'll present. Some of the other considerations that we've come across as we've worked on this, and Charlie brought this up, is involving someone from the Board of Public Works in some of this material, because it involves the development review process of inspections and guarantees. They're involved in it. So I think Charlie made that suggestion, and I think that's something we could talk about at this meeting.
Go, Charlie.
Another, related to that was also, when I started working on these various utility code sections, it was really going to be cumbersome to throw in every single detailed requirement. So the board already has standards and for both electrical and their water and sewer systems. So I think what we've been talking about, Tom, Janelle, and I, is just referencing those standards. But the thing about those standards is the water and sewer are in really good shape. I would say they're 95%. Maybe they need 5% of tweaking. The electrical standards are pretty old, and I know you've been kind of sending us some stuff on lightings. So those need to be looked at, but the board needs to be part of that discussion.
Great. And I think it's good to bring them in conceptually now before we write a lot of ordinance language, because again, it refers back and forth, and there's other parts of the city ordinance or chapter or it's a whole code that might reference something else with those. So it's good to bring them in early and bounce ideas off them.
So, thanks.
Similar to that is I've worked recently on the landscaping and trees, and I've gotten some good material from other references in other communities, but I do think, similar to the Board of Public Works, that landscaping and trees is definitely something Parks and Recreation works on, and we should probably bring them into the loop of when the subcommittee looks at the draft material, and if you're okay conceptually with it, maybe we share that with Marty or someone at the Parks and Recreation and see if they have any ideas that we could look at and consider as we move forward with it. And then the last one, we talked, I think, at one of our early meetings about one of the big stakeholders of this whole process is the development community. And I think at some point we might want to consider how to do that. We might not be there yet because we don't have everything on paper, but I think at some point before we take it too far into the public meetings and things, is get some feedback from that community. I don't know, Janelle, if you've had ideas on it or.
So I've actually kind of reached out to some of the engineers and some of the developers that I kind of know and have worked with in the past, and go like, hey, be aware of this subcommittee, go back, look at the other things, please feel free to join in if you want. So then we can get their comments as we move through. So a number of people have been made aware of this, and they said, okay, great, I'm going to keep my eye out. listened to it, and everybody who I told about the new process, it was like, yes, they liked it. But that was just the whole process of getting through the review process and not a lot of the design standards and stuff. But they've been made aware that there is this subcommittee and a lot of happenings going on. So
Okay.
hopefully somebody out there in the interweb is paying attention.
Webby. So those are the talking points I had on the where we are, the status. Is there any questions you guys might have for us?
Yes,
Before we dive
I
in?
had some questions.
Uh-huh.
Hi, this is Nancy. I'm not in the room. That's why you hear just the voice from afar.
I keep thinking it's Anne Marie from outside the hall.
I had a couple questions, and, after reflecting on our last meeting, I tried to look over the process and really ask myself the question, the way in which we're changing the process, does this require a change in the process of anyone else who's involved? And I wasn't seeing anything that just like really glaringly stuck out, but has someone who hopefully is, more knowledgeable than I am of some of the other organizations that are involved, do we think there are any conflicts that we're putting in place here?
So from what I can see, no. Or actually getting some of the agencies a little bit ahead of time. But subdivisions still have to go through Parks and Rec before they get to the Planning Commission. So that process really doesn't change. And then it's you guys. So that's the one big process that I can think of. And that stays completely the same. The requirement is that they go through the Parks and Rec Commission. Maybe we can make that a little bit better explained in the code about the process. Charlie?
I can't remember if we've talked about this, sorry Nancy, but, where the remand on the one development to develop some more detailed stormwater management plans resulted in a plan that was completely approved during the preliminary process. And I don't know that that's good or bad, because I think there's some bad and some good to it. But are we going to delineate exactly what we want in terms of that? Because that's popping up more and more, that we want more stormwater management information during the preliminary review process. Maybe not the full approval, but.
But yeah, so we had discussed early on about how do we know that they've actually met with the Conservation District and DelDOT. So I actually had a conversation with the Conservation District, and they actually require, I think it's called a step 1 or something. And they require a meeting with the developer, and they take notes, and they said they would be happy to provide a letter saying that they met with them and a copy of those meeting minutes or something to that effect to go that, yes, they've met with the developer, they know some of the issues going on, so we know they're not going in blind when it gets submitted to the city, so we have some background on conservation, on stormwater management. And I was also, in the way my head was thinking, it's like, okay, because we're putting all the design guidelines together, and it's like, okay, but in the preliminary review, it's like, these are the items we need for preliminary review. We're gonna need those plus another list for final.
Okay.
So, well, we need general information for preliminary review. It's like, okay, where are your ponds going? Where's your outfall? General information, but all the engineering gets done at the final. Kind of like it, to a degree it is now, but we can specify different things. And I think we talked about like if DelDOT requires a traffic impact study, a TIS, that's something that should be done at the Planning Commission stage. Those results should be done before a recommendation is made and it goes to planning, to mayor and council. So we have those types of information. And I think we always we were going to put in some room to allow if the commission needed additional detail, they could, but like clearly kind of delineating, this is what you're looking at preliminary, because again, we're talking preliminary review, and even the council's still going to see a preliminary review. And then if council then says, okay, it's good, then they'll go and do all that detailed engineering.
Okay.
Does that work for you, Charlie?
Yeah, I think definitely definitely. It was to Nancy's point about whether I was thinking specific about SCD or DENREC, are we getting them out in front of things that they shouldn't be out in front of?
Right, yeah, I think what we're looking for is like preliminary information, like having them at least know that there's an application coming. You know, they won't, like, some of the agencies don't have the person power to review a plan to provide us comments, but at least we know they've met with them.
Yeah.
So then they just go off on their individual agency process, but we can more clearly define what's required for preliminary and then what's required for final.
Okay.
Janelle?
And then
Are we-
I just have two more
Oh,
questions.
okay, go ahead, Nancy, sorry.
The second one is, we've mentioned, Tom, about different sections that basically call out to or reference someone else's, whether it's BPW's or, you know, someone else's standards that have to be met. When we go with that and we don't include those in our document, and they make changes to that, how are we notified? And I'm just, you know, we're thinking of how we're notifying others. I'm also asking the question, is there some process in place that notifies us? Because someone could make a change that we think isn't sufficient for what we want.
Well, the couple ideas I have, one is in the code in preliminary consent right now, which will become preliminary plan review, there's a section for other reviews, and that's all it says. It doesn't have much information at all. And I do think we're still kind of gathering information, I think, from like SCD and how others review things. And we'll probably I think my idea is to make that more defined about when reviews do come in, who do they go to, and how is it done. And reviews always change, so I think we would just reference it and say as the review changes in our code, so we don't have to change it all the time. But the other big thing I think that's important is the state plus review. That's for certain size developments, and that should be a good bit of the major subdivisions. The state does come together and provide a letter, as you've seen, that's DENREC review and DELDOT and others, the fire marshal. I think it'd be good if we can coordinate with that activity so that it comes in during preliminary plan for the planning commission and council to have that information. That'll be a good reference for us to look at.
And I think in that section, we can reference, you know, agencies such as, but not limited to BPW, SCD, DELDOT, and they're subject to their rules and regulations. So we don't adopt DELDOT's standards. We just say you have to go get DELDOT's approval, and then they have their standards, or SCD's, the Conservation District's standards. So they could change, but it's that agency that's then making sure that any plan complies with their rules and regulations. Then we make sure that we get that approval letter before we can let it be recorded, if that helps and answers your question.
Yes. And then my last question, and this is really probably more of a question for Glenn, so it's good to see you there, Glenn. When we've moved to this format, which I think is a neat and clean format of having a statement of intent, then standards, and then guidelines. It seems to me when I'm looking at a lot of areas where there's debate and conflict, it often has to do with whether one is meeting a standard, but not the intent. And so what is the legal force of the statement of intent? And where we have these guidelines, it really sounds kind of like it's nice to do, because everything just says, you know, that you've given consideration. And, you know, I can say, yeah, I considered it, I thought about it, you know, I'm not going to share with you what I thought, but I did it, you know.
Well, so as far as standards go, standards are those things that you can approve or deny a subdivision project upon. Typically, an intent is more giving you a flavor as a planning commission of what sorts of conditions you might want to be considering attaching. So if the intent, you know, the intent clause is kind of typically, the intent clauses are a little bit more generalized. In Lewis, we're more specific than other jurisdictions, but generally, the intent clause is to allow a planning commission to know generally what are we trying to achieve in the city of Lewis. The standards hopefully try to flush out in more detail what those, what the intent of the chapter is, but there's case law dealing with purpose clauses. And the purpose clauses, which is sort of like an intent clause, and generally in most codes, purpose clauses are 3 or 4 sentences, not like our code that has very detailed subcategories under the purpose section. But there's case law that indicates that you can't deny a subdivision project solely on a purpose clause. You've got to find some other criteria within the code, some other standards that the subdivision doesn't satisfy. So the standards, I think, carry maybe a little more force of law than an intent clause does.
And would the same be true that you can't deny something based on it not meeting the intent?
That's generally right. I mean, if the intent is not satisfied by and evidenced, by some standards not being achieved, then sure, you can deny it based upon the standards that aren't achieved, which are the embodiments of the intent clause. But the cases I'm referring to, a planning commission says, well, the broad purpose clause says this, and I don't feel like this subdivision is accomplishing that broad purpose clause. However, it's meeting every other standard, what you were talking about earlier, Nancy, meeting all these standards, but not meeting the intent. If you meet all these standards, it's very, very rare and maybe not ever possible to deny a project based just upon the purpose or intent clause.
And if you, based on, if someone, these are all hypothetical. Hypothetically, someone meets all of the standards, but the planning commission, based on the intent clause, has identified some conditions that they feel need to be met.
Yes.
And can the applicant choose not to meet those conditions?
No, I mean, a conditional approval is an approval with conditions. If you don't satisfy the conditions, you've not satisfied the approval. So it's not optional for a developer. If a project is approved with conditions, the conditions have the force of law, and the developer must comply with the conditions, or else they can't move forward.
So in the situation in which and I'm thinking something in the future where we didn't think of a standard, either new construction technology, I know, one can't imagine the future, right? Where all the standards are met and there's a belief by the planning commission that the intent is being missed in some way, whether it's open space or, whatever, and the planning commission gives conditional approval, setting a condition that isn't described in the standards, that the commission would like to have met.
Yes, you can attach those.
If that is not met, they can deny.
That's right. But the conditions, though, have to be reasonable. They have to be related to a specific health, welfare, or safety concern that you've identified and is on the record. There's evidence in the record that there's a real issue that's not dealt with in any of the standards. Then yes, you can apply a reasonable condition that's tailored to resolve whatever that health, welfare, or safety issue is.
And the way I see it is your standards are to implement your intent, your purpose. So if your intent and your standards are out of alignment, that's when you go look at the code and make that fix. But I think if they're meeting the standards and then they're meeting the intent, but you think maybe they should be doing one of those guidelines, that you can make it, you can recommend approval with the condition that they meet X, Y, and Z guidelines.
And that elevates the guideline now to something that has the force of law.
Because then that for that instance, because not all guidelines are going to make sense for every application, but maybe like C, Q, and W make sense for this application. So as part of the approval, while you met the standards and you're meeting the intent, we think if you meet those three guidelines, then you are even further meeting the intent, and then they end up becoming the standard and the requirement for that application in specific. So if you adopt a condition, then technically that condition becomes a standard for that application only. Does that make sense? Because that ends up becoming a requirement that you have to do before you move forward. And again, your conditions would always be just a recommendation to council, and then council will get it, and they can go, I don't like that condition, but I want these 2 other conditions, so they can change it.
Okay. Thank
And I
you.
don't think that this is we're not giving you, this will solve all your problems. It's getting closer by establishing an intent and tightening up standards because of newer research or technology, and then adding guidelines in for things that I think come up at meetings, but they're not always in the ordinance or not expressed, so the developer doesn't know it and the public doesn't know it. But it's useful information because it's something that is worth discussing, even if all they have to do is look at it and say, I've pursued that. To have those discussions ahead of time and have them at the meeting, oftentimes they turn into something that's achieved by the development.
Thank you.
Was that all your questions for now? For that
I'm
part?
done for now.
Okay, the one question I had. Hello? The one question I had for Janelle a few minutes ago was, when you're farming these out to various departments or agencies and that, with perhaps new information and plans or whatever, are you giving them any deadlines as to when you want these back? I mean, if it's new and scary, they might just sit on it.
Oh, no, so we would work out with that agency, like for the conservation district. If they're gonna meet with them, maybe that's something we require at the time of submission. Like currently we require a letter from BPW at the time of the application, of the submission of the application, that there's an ability to serve.
Okay.
So maybe at that point, we require a letter from the conservation district or DelDOT to verify they've met their first step and met with them.
Right.
Maybe it's not at the time of application, maybe it's, so many days before planning commission, so, you're not getting on the agenda if I don't have this verification, so then everything's then in the packet.
Right.
So you guys would have that prior to the meeting.
Yeah, that's sort of like the plus review. If you missed a deadline, you're another month away, yes.
You wait a month, but yeah, I think it's something that doesn't go, I wouldn't put that in code. I would just, that's something that, staff and the agencies would work out, and to make sure it's like, okay, we know, okay, if it's not coming within the application, it has to be in so many days before the agenda gets set, because of them, you can't put something on the agenda.
Something you could establish during your Is this something you could establish during your pre-application meeting?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Great.
And we could also put it in the checklist. This is a requirement at time of submission, or this is something that's required, so many days before the agenda gets set, like the 30 days before the agenda gets set or something like that. So there's a bunch of different things we can look at.
But that's all the responsibility of the developer. That's not Janelle divvying out plans to DelDOT, DNREC, anybody else. That's on the developer.
Yeah, because based on how I've talked to Conservation District and DelDOT, they require pre-application meetings, step 1 meetings. So it's like, I'm not going to send anything to them. I'm just going to require proof that they actually met with them, and that will come from the Conservation District said we would be happy to send you they can't do an extra review, which I completely understand, but they can verify and provide meeting minutes or other things that they've met their step 1 requirement.
The only one that's a little bit different is like the BPW review that I typically do. But again, we coordinate,
Yes.
you tell me you need it in 3 weeks or 4 weeks, and I tell you 8. But no, I'm just kidding. But no, but we always coordinate in a similar way, really.
Yeah, and I think we can, as we keep evolving this, I think we can start informally set some deadlines,
Yeah.
like, okay, we know this application's coming in, and then we know we want it to get to planning commission at this time, and we'll just back it up, everything, so we know when we need to have stuff back, so we can get it onto an agenda.
That's a good idea, because it doesn't happen very often, but once in a while, like a developer will come back with a revised set of plans 2 weeks before the next planning commission meeting and expect to be on the agenda, that kind of thing.
That never happens.
It doesn't happen as much as you would think, but it does happen.
Yeah, and then trying to do a whole other review, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully this new process and the way it's laid out is really going to alleviate a lot of that, a lot of those issues from coming up.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm hoping for the pre-application meeting that if I get Charlie or somebody from GMB in the room, then they're looking at engineering, BPW items, I'm looking at planning items, and we're just gonna like, okay, you got fire marshal, SCD, DelDOT, Office of Drinking Water, whatever, or other places, and it's like, go forth and go, but we've red flagged everything we think is
Yeah.
gonna be a red flag, so
Yeah.
hopefully it streamlines and makes the process easier for everybody.
Any more questions on the overview? If you could bring up the PowerPoint, Janelle. Just to give an overview of the PowerPoint, this isn't anything new. I thought it would be helpful to show you the parts of the code that we're focusing on and that we're looking at changing. I think the entire subdivision ordinance we need to look at, because there's little pieces like the building officials sprinkled throughout it, and we need to change. We need to look at every sentence, but we're really honing in on certain sections and modifying it for the reasons or the things that we've talked about in our meetings. And I thought I would just run through that, and this will be on the website, so it's good for the public to look at too, and just follow along the sections that we're looking at. So I hope to spend 10 or 15 minutes on this and then get into some of the standards language that we hope to get some feedback on. So
I don't know whether it's possible to share this on Zoom at the same time that you have it on the screen, because I think the attendees who have dialed in, and certainly I can't see it.
Janelle's getting to it. Thank
Okay,
you.
great, thank you.
let me know when you're there, Janelle. I'll just start with some overview.
You can go ahead, Tom, and we'll catch up,
It's there.
So
There it is,
this PowerPoint show just shows the articles that we're working on, the high points. So the first one's Article 1, General Provisions. The first highlighted section, I don't know if you can read it, but it's definitions and word usage. The first column, it's down in the middle. We've already identified a few dozen definitions that we need to look at. We haven't written that yet. You noticed in some of the standards that I put in some definitions that are new and not familiar, but I think definitions are something that it's an evolving thing and you work at throughout the process, and then you come back and make sure they're all right at the end. But that's a big section that we'll be working on continuously. The next one down is section 170-10, which is now called designation of minor or major subdivisions. This is where we're going to introduce the pre-application meeting into the process. The reason we put it here is that it's not always clear to us or the public without seeing information if it's minor or major. And we think the best way to address that is to have a pre-application meeting or a discussion with Janelle and the applicant to make that determination. So that part of it, there's a new paragraph A that talks about the pre-application meeting, and we looked at that in an earlier meeting, so I won't go into the details on it. And then the last section in Article 1 is the minor lot line adjustment, which is a newer provision. I think this is just a housekeeping thing, that a minor, it's technically referred to as a minor subdivision, so we think it's better taking this out of Article 1, which is general provisions, and putting it in Article 2, minor subdivision. I think that's where people would look for it at, and it fits better into there. So that's all on Article 1. The next slide, Janelle. Major subdivisions, Article 3. So there's a lot that we'll be looking at here. The first thing is that, and we talked about this before, I know I won't read it to you in detail, but you could look at it on the website or our previous discussions, we talked about it. This is just saying what the preliminary review of a major subdivision's about. As you know, if you've heard previous meetings, we're looking at changing it from preliminary consent, which suggests approval, to preliminary review. So the Planning Commission is reviewing it. And the new part, which we'll look at later, is council will now have a role in the first phase of it, preliminary review. They will be approving the preliminary plan to move to the next stage. They're not approving the subdivision. They're giving approval to move to the next stage. But we're referring to it, so to kind of clarify it, that it's preliminary review and taking consent out. That's what this paragraph talks about. It just tries to clarify for everybody that what the purpose of preliminary review is to introduce the expectations to the applicant and to the public, and to bring the public into the review process, for public meetings. That's what this paragraph clarifies for. It's a new paragraph.
Hey, Tom, on that, does it still have to receive Planning Commission approval before it goes to the council?
No, the Planning Commission's providing a recommendation.
Any
It could be,
recommendation?
yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
So the next area is preliminary consent. Again, a lot under this. I already talked about, as you can see at the top, we're changing it from preliminary consent to preliminary review. Let me go to this slide so I can read it a little bit closer. The first highlighted part's just talking about you have to have a pre-application meeting. That's letting the applicant know. And the next section, which we need to look at quite a bit more, is what's in a preliminary plan review. What kind of content are they submitting? So we've highlighted it here, and we've talked about some things that need to be added to it, but we haven't changed it yet. But this part of it will change quite a bit. Can we move to the next slide? This is along those same lines. This is plan content, what's in it. This is actually from a final plan. And Janelle, you had suggested that we consider moving a lot of these details up to preliminary review. So I just brought this slide in, and do you want to mention anything more about that?
Sure. So I was just kind of looking at like, oh, these are all the requirements. So I thought we'd just kind of start moving things around. So if you think about the Planning Commission review, this is the way my head's thinking is, okay, this is Planning Commission review. This is what you need to submit. These are all the criteria that you have to meet to provide on the plan for preliminary. And then it'll talk about, I lost my train of thought, the question that was asked earlier.
Who does the other reviews?
Who does the other reviews? Oh, and then this, Charlie, then this section about Planning Commission will say, okay, this is what this is, these are the requirements, and this is what Planning Commission does. This is where it says Planning Commission makes a recommendation to Mayor and Council. And then we get into Mayor and Council, what they need to submit for there, what the requirements are, which I don't think are gonna change too much between Planning Commission and Council, because they're all you're gonna have a set of what requirements are for preliminary review, and then the process for if after Planning Commission hears it, or Council hears it, what's the next step then? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, just like if Planning Commission puts conditions on their recommendation, then those plans would need to reflect that before it got to council, or not?
I think that's something we can
Talk about.
talk about, and I've seen it both ways. I've seen it both ways where it's, Planning Commission makes a recommendation and they want conditions, but they're just making a recommendation of those conditions. So sometimes the developer's like, yeah, those conditions I will do, and we'll then revise the plan. And sometimes it's like, I don't like that condition, I'm gonna argue that before council.
Yeah.
So sometimes the plans will change and sometimes they won't. So I think if we work in, like if somebody's gonna do a resubmittal between Planning Commission and council, that we put something in there if they're gonna do a resubmittal, that we get it in a certain time frame, because we're gonna have to review it again. And then that would then go to council. But I think of it as not everything's gonna get fixed, because again, we're still talking about preliminary plan. So maybe it's not all the conditions get addressed, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, and then it goes to council. Council can see, okay, here's the preliminary plan, it could be the exact same plan, but commission recommended all of these conditions upon it, and they can consider all of those. And then maybe even the council could go, well, I want to actually see the plan with those recommendations and those conditions on it before they make a final recommendation regarding the preliminary plan. I think there's some options. I see Glenn thinking about it, liking it, not liking it, legal issues. Because I think if we leave it a little bit of flexibility, it puts more onerous on the developer, like, okay, you planning commission made recommendations, made conditions, you can either address them, or you can wait and see what council wants to do.
Yeah. I just know how engineers think too, because if it goes through planning commission and there's 10 conditions, they're gonna address those 10 conditions plus all these other things that they begin to see too. And those are things that we haven't already reviewed, but we should review, other revisions that they're making.
Yeah, so I'm gonna tell people, when I review a plan, I'm not just looking at it from a preliminary perspective, I'm looking holistically, like, hey, this is everything you're gonna have to fix, I don't care when it has to get fixed. And even in my letters, it's like, hey, by the way, most of this just has to be done before final. So, don't worry about it, but hey, I've caught it, so just keep it in the back of your head before, if this gets to final, I need that fixed. So then I can just go back to my holistic review, 4, 5, 6 pages long, however it is, and then check that off while checking everything else. That's how I review plans. Everybody's different.
Yeah.
Okay, back to you, Tom, sorry.
All right, I hate to make you jump up and change the
That's
next
okay.
slide.
Get my steps in today.
We need Alexa to just say next slide. So this one, I know it's kind of hard to read. This is one that it's been something we've, I think, talked about over the years. When someone submits a major application, if you look at the provisions, it says what they're giving you and how they're giving an application. It also says that they have to notify by certified mail that an application's reviewed. And it also is supposed to put in there when you can come for a public meeting and other information. And it's unfortunately very early in the process. It might be what's happening is that.
This is to the neighbors.
Yeah, to the
Okay,
neighbors.
give us that word, okay.
One thing is, we don't know when a public meeting's going to be because staff are now just getting it. So it may be 4 or 5 months before there is a public meeting. And one of the things we've looked at as staff is, should there be some consideration that this certified mailing and public notice doesn't happen when they're submitting it, but at a later time that makes more sense when, one, the city knows when it's going to be having public meetings. Probably, the pre-application meeting, we might have more understanding of when that would be, but it's really unfortunate that sometimes these letters go out and it's half a year later that they can actually meet to talk about it. So that's one of the things that I thought made sense when I was here doing it, that it's going out pretty early and we can't even put on the sign when a meeting's going to be or things like that. So one of the things we've looked at as staff is there some notification that could be tweaks done that it's going out at a more timely instance so that the public's now aware of it and then they can go look at stuff that's on the website and they know when meetings are going to come up instead of just calling us and we're all saying, we're just starting to look at this now.
And the intent is also to clean up the public notice requirement, because for planning, you notice when you make the application, and then this is due at the time of preliminary consent, and then this is due for the public hearing, and then there's a totally different process for mayor and council, and it's like, let's just condense it into one category called public notice. And this is what you need to do for, for the public hearings. This is the requirement. Anytime there's a public hearing, you do newspaper or posting or letters to the property owners, but it's all in like one location. So whenever you have a public hearing, this is the public notice process for a public hearing. And I think it also then helps, because sometimes when an application comes in, they don't have a lot of stuff with it sometimes. And it's like, we're asking for stuff or we're suggesting stuff, and the people start calling. But then it's like, you really have to watch an agenda or read the newspaper for when it gets to planning commission. So it's like, how do we reduce that gap and ensure there's better public notice, or it's cleaner?
And more consistent, I think.
How far is the standard public notice? You said we can't put out public notice until how far in advance of a meeting?
So typically, the agendas get posted 7 days, but typically notice is 10 to 15 days prior to the meeting. Public notice either has to be sent, so the letters are postmarked that 15 or 10 days in advance.
From the developer, right?
From the developer, and a legal ad is put in the newspaper. It also, this would clean up who sends the legal ad, because sometimes it's the developer and sometimes it's the city, and who's got what responsibility, and it's like, it gets very confusing.
Do you send out notices to the residents or to the property owners, which may be different?
So I believe the state code says it goes to the property owners.
Okay.
Because we don't always have the information as to who the resident is, because if it's a rental, like a long-term rental, somebody's just renting a house, I don't know who that is.
Okay.
But we always send everything to the property owner.
Very good, okay.
And another part is the sign goes up, so you may be a renter, but you see a sign.
Right.
And we want to consolidate all of that, so it's roughly the same time. Sometimes the signs go out very early and they're not there when the meeting comes up. So we want to try and make it so it's more meaningful, I guess, and consistent.
Yes.
The notification process.
Good.
The next one is just more housekeeping somewhat. There's a thing called City Engineer and Board of Works Report. One thought is to call it just a staff report, because there's a lot more people who are involved in this process, so change the name to that. And then also, one of the questions was to rework this into a policy. Not a policy meaning it's not standard, so Charlie's not writing detailed standards solely at preliminary review. We want to provide guidance to the people who are involved in this. And a lot of times you are trying to write what's the tax base issues or the improvements and things like that. You don't have enough information. But you do have enough information to say, here's the information we need, here's who you need to talk to. So we wanted to look at this list, which I know you can't read here, but it's trying to make sure that the information coming out from the staff is giving them enough information with the general information we have. So it's just reworking it a bit.
Yeah, that actually is a good point. It gets me thinking, I know when I do my preliminary reviews on those plans, it's more related to the intent of a water utility section of the code, but not so much the actual detailed standards. And we will let them know that, hey, here are the standards right here in the code and in the board's booklet of standards, but you know, like for instance, they'll show water main under sidewalk, and we'll tell them at the preliminary stage, no, we don't want that, we want it out in the
But at
road.
final, you need to bring, and you can give them information on
Yeah.
what you're providing
Yeah.
for under the sidewalk.
Yeah, that's interesting, yeah.
So it's broadening the list for others beyond the city engineer and BPW, but also, you know, so Janelle's report's part of that, or Parks and Recreation and other things. So that report would go to the Planning Commission, then it would go to City Council as well for the next review.
Can I ask a question about BPW? So in our comp plan, it says that BPW is responsible for stormwater management. But yet,
Does it say management?
it's one of the responsibilities that's assigned to BPW is responsibility for stormwater management. But yet we rely on the Sussex Conservation District. But then that was recently pointed out in a public hearing that can they really use the SCD as an approval, or is we still awaiting on a municipality standard? So is there a way to work in BPW into the standard of stormwater management?
Oh, I'm pretty sure Anne Marie's gonna say you need to be at the mic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is That's exactly why I'm walking this way, sorry. Yeah.
Our apologies.
I couldn't hear, which probably means that.
The people on the interweb
get
can't
that.
hear us.
It's a good
so-
question.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so the gist of the question is, BPW in Lewis's comprehensive plan is identified as the entity responsible for Lewis's stormwater management. But my question is, are they part of the approval, or is there a check that they've signed off on that stormwater management now? And how do you weight their approval versus SCD? And I mean, that's basically the confusion that seems to have come up recently is, if someone gets their SCD approval, is that the gold standard? Does that mean they can move forward?
So the way it,
Andrew Williams, 107 McKee.
sorry about that. So the way it's always worked is that the BPW reviews the stormwater collection system, the catch basins, piping, and everything that leads to the stormwater management system. The stormwater management system has always been reviewed by SCD against the state regulations. I would recommend that you keep it right there. I mean, it's the city's and the board's decisions, but those guys have got so much experience, and there's so much detailed analysis that goes into those stormwater management reviews. To put it in the hands of the city and the board would be a lot. I mean, it can be done. We could do it, but it's a lot. So it sounds like there's been some confusion because the demarcation point has always been where the pipe discharges into the stormwater management system, and then that's SCD. And not only that, once the system's built, it's always on the property owner association. And my feeling on that was always that the board and the city wanted to keep it in their hands because it would be very expensive for the board to maintain all the different stormwater management systems throughout the city, because they're not all the same. Everyone's a little bit different. So there's like two pieces of the stormwater management. There's the review and approval, and then there's the actual operation and maintenance after it's been built.
And also for clarification is that the city is required to follow the state guidelines and regulations for stormwater management. The city itself has not been designated as being able to review the stormwater management facilities independently. There are a few cities, I think in Newcastle County, that have that were designated that from DENREC, but everybody else uses, in Kent County, they use the Kent Conservation District, and in here, the Sussex County, you use the Sussex Conservation District as the review, because they have the authority from the state and the expertise to review and approve the stormwater management facilities.
And just another little wrinkle to that is that any project that's funded by state monies, it doesn't go through SCD, it actually goes through the DENREC Stormwater Management Review Group up in Dover. So it's a little different.
I think the bottom line, it comes down to there's multiple, the city's involved, BPW's involved with the collection system, SCD's involved, DENREC's involved. I think when SCD reviews it, they're reviewing it, as Janelle was saying, against the state law, but
Correct.
they also say in their letters that the city or the municipality can have other provisions for stormwater management, which is a section, a set of standards that we're going to be looking at soon. So hopefully we can clarify that.
I just always felt it was risky, though, for the city and the board to have a separate standard from the well-researched state regulations that are so, if you look at them, they're just so detailed. I mean, they're hundreds of pages.
Yeah, I
And-
guess,
and-
I think it's from a land use standpoint.
Okay.
You know, runoff of what's generated, and some of the best management practices are systems that are not engineered systems, they're more,
Rain barrels, green roofs.
yeah, sure.
Planter
Mitigation.
boxes.
Yeah.
Mitigation.
right.
Some of those
things
items.
might solve a lot of the
Sure, yeah,
stormwater
that's a good-
problems
that's
before
actually a
you're
good idea,
engineering
yeah.
it.
So back in my, and I'm gonna jump ahead and everybody can yell at me, but like guidelines or some standards for stormwater management in the city's code could be like encouraging rain barrels and porous pavement and permeable pavers and stuff like that to help, because we know we have items that could be impacted and that could be helpful.
Yeah, thank you, because I was doing okay with the intent and standard sections of the water, sewer, and electric, but I couldn't come up with guidelines at all hardly. But I think those kind of sustainable approaches are definitely things we could put in there like
Yeah,
that.
I don't think there's gonna be a lot of. Button, there we go. I think for some of the standards, there aren't gonna be guidelines.
Yeah.
You know, and, I mean, for water and sewer, I don't know if there are guidelines. These are the standards. You know, but for other things, you know, for like landscaping and other things, there might be some,
Sure, yeah.
you know, some BMPs, best management practices, that could make their way into standards, or just could be guidelines, that then could be conditions that are placed upon an application, depending on what it is and where it's at.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I don't see everything having guidelines because of just, some of the engineering stuff is just so technical, there really aren't.
I have 0 for sewer and 1 questionable one for water right now, so I think you're right.
Well, good question on stormwater management. I think it's a broad picture. Okay.
Thank you. Clarification. Charlie, did you say that the state agency that regulates stormwater management, their requirements are applicable when it's a municipal type of stormwater management infrastructure?
No, so like, for instance, the school district, because they're receiving state funding, those projects get reviewed through DNREC, not SED. It has to do with the funding.
Right, it's the funding piece.
Yes.
Okay, so the fact that we're talking about private development in this case with subdivisions, that would all come under the SCD, correct?
Yes, I think, but, you know, we also have a site development section of this chapter, so in that case, it might fall into the DNREC fold if the funding's that way.
School was DNREC, right, and then others were, like if it was a store or something, it would be county.
The conservation district.
Right, it could be the conservation district.
Yeah.
One of my questions about, and one of my concerns is if any agency on the county level or state level is in fact looking at the consequence of the effect, the impact of the stormwater management pond holistically, so that it's not just, you know, a particular site, a 50-acre site that's being developed and its stormwater management assets, infrastructure, but how that fits into the puzzle of all the other parcels around it, which might be developed or not developed. Is there anyone?
So I believe the conservation district, depending on what you're doing, may ask for upstream and downstream impacts. So they're looking beyond just that development. And that they want to know, okay, what's going, you know, so many feet, so many miles upstream or downstream, to make sure that what's happening within that area is being addressed.
Okay.
Well, for sure, the watershed of any particular subdivision development almost always will extend beyond the boundaries of that development, and it has to be part of the stormwater management calculation. And that's upstream. The downstream side, anything that leaves that stormwater management system, whether it be a detention pond, retention pond, biofiltration, has to be checked out downstream so that the downstream systems can handle the amount of water that's going into it.
Can you describe how that's actually achieved if downstream the infrastructure is already in place?
So.
And what they'll have to
they would-
overmanage on their site to ensure they're not impacting the.
And usually when they design these things, they're designing it to pre-development rates, so it's not a big problem, but they still oftentimes have to look, if they're discharging, say, for instance, into a DelDOT road stormwater collection system, they would need to find out all the details of that stormwater collection system to make sure that those pipes are sized appropriately for the discharge from the new development.
Right.
And if it discharges into a DelDOT stormwater, DelDOT's going to review it to make sure their pipes are adequate.
And if it drains into a stream, a creek, and so forth, how is that taken into consideration?
Similarly, yes, very similarly, there's a capacity to that stream. You know, like I said, they're designed to go to pre-development rates, but if you have a 50 or 100-year storm, you're not getting it to the pre-development rate. It's going to, there's an overflow. So
Right.
that would probably occur anyway, but it's a little bit of a different game at that point.
Yeah, and currently, I know of an application that they are so, because of the pre-development, stormwater management, that they have to manage stormwater from multiple other properties because of how it impacts theirs. So they're not just dealing with their stormwater management, they have to manage other people's stormwater management because of what they're looking to do. So they have to address that, and so they're gonna be building larger facilities to handle what's currently coming through their property.
Right, because the property under development in that example is downstream to the neighbors.
Well, no, it's just the way the stormwater flows.
Right.
Yeah.
They're downstream.
Tim, it's a good point. I've not ever seen it in Lewis, but I have seen it in other municipalities where future projects, stormwater collection and runoff is diverted into an existing stormwater management system, and that stormwater management system is upgraded to handle that additional flow. I've never seen that in Lewis, but it could happen at some point. It
Have
might
you
even
seen
be.
it anywhere in Sussex County?
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
I think there's places in the state in Delaware that are under the MS4 program. And when you're under that program and it's based on population, you have to have a stormwater management plan that and all municipalities have to adhere to it, of having a understanding where their runoff's coming from, what it's projected to be. And then usually they develop a program that either they're improving their systems, or residents are paying into the system to either do recharge on their property or paying the municipality to upgrade its systems. But generally, those plans are built where each municipality is required to manage its stormwater. Lewis doesn't have that yet, but other parts of Delaware are. It'll be, again, it's based on population, so I don't know if the 2020 population's put us over yet, but that's another way that it's handled holistically.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right, you ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the next slide is just the diagram of the workflow, and we've looked at this before. This is the proposed where it's preliminary review, not preliminary consent. And it's shifting, we've looked at this before where the current one, and this is the proposed, where at the planning commission level, it's a review. And if you look at the bottom, the second one from the bottom, that's mayor and city council is involved in preliminary review. That's not the case right now. I'm just revisiting this flow chart, and then the next slide's showing what sections of the code this impacts. Okay, so the first part of it is in Article 3, major subdivisions under preliminary consent. Subsection E is the planning commission. So this is just saying it's reworded from the current ordinance. I know you can't read it, but it's basically saying that the planning commission's not approving preliminary consent. They're providing recommendations, reviewing the plan, holding a public hearing, and then making its recommendation to city council. You also see below, under subsection E right now, there's 22 considerations. As we've talked about in the past, we're changing those. They won't be the 22 considerations. We've looked at those. Are they standards? Are they guidelines? Are they intent statements? My thought is they're all of the above. And what we've looked at is we're going to consolidate all the standards in Article 4, which we'll look at later on. The intent statements from there that we talked about earlier is what will come here. So it's not a specific measurable standard that the Planning Commission's looking at, or even City Council at preliminary review. It's more about what the intent is, and preliminary review is to inform the applicant of the expectations of what they need to do for final plan when they do need to come in and meet all the standards. So again, I'm just running through how the code's changing based on the flow diagram that we've talked about and thought about moving forward with. So the next slide, Janelle. Under preliminary, it still says preliminary consent on the side, but it's preliminary plan approval or review. This is a new section in here. It's much like in the final plan where it's saying mayor and city council will meet. They'll actually have a public hearing again after the planning commission has made its recommendation to them. They'll have Parks and Rec review, and hopefully they will have all the other material from SCD and others that have submitted information. So a new public hearing will be held under the current process or proposed process. Mayor and council would then meet and vote on preliminary plan approval, which doesn't approve the subdivision. It simply says you can now proceed to final plan. So it's giving the green light for staff to accept final plans with their recommendations and conditions that mayor and council makes. This is new. Mayor and council are not involved until final plan under the current process. So this is a thought process that the subcommittees talked about in the past, and we're working on how to make it happen in the ordinance.
And I think that's also very good for us as a planning commission, because a lot of times when we're going through this process and we go so far into it, and then you guys get a hack at it and we're like, oh, wow, that's information we could have used earlier, So when it comes down to streamlining process, I'm really in favor of that change. Hope you are too.
I think they will be, because I think there's been almost every project doesn't make it to council until you guys have been through a very thorough process with the developer. And then, that's their first take, the council's first take at it, and they probably have comments.
Right.
So this is a whole new inclusion in preliminary review. It changes the planning commission's role and council's role at that stage of the process.
Tom, is the developer doing a presentation on his project, or are you doing the dog and pony show, or who presents it?
As I mentioned, they will schedule a public hearing, so council can make the determination, and usually it's, they will give indications to an applicant if they wish to present, they can. Usually staff are walking council through the material, but hopefully more and more, a lot of that material is in the agenda packet or online, and they're just asking Janelle to walk them through the process to familiarize it or call anything out. And they're also, at public hearing, they're asking the applicant in most cases to present.
Yeah.
After public hearing or when they close for public comment, usually they don't do that.
Okay.
Yeah, typically, as part of the public hearing, that's when the developer is making their application. So your presentation as part of the public hearing is typically, they'll go first, present their application, and then everybody else, people get to ask questions, people get to provide their comments, and that's taken all into consideration. And that at some point, the commission then closes their record, and then based on all the information in their record, they make that recommendation to council. Then council will kind of do the whole process all over again, hold a public hearing, the developer gets to present their application, ask questions, hear from the public, close the record, and then they make the decision regarding the preliminary plan.
So this last slide, which is already up, is just showing we're moving to section 17020, which is right now called council approval. The proposal is to call it final plan approval to contrast it to preliminary plan. It won't change a lot from its current, what's in there right now. The only thing that's not involved right now, it's all the engineer and staff review. The planning commission doesn't have a review role in it right now, and that's what we had in the workflow, but it's something that I don't see too many changes in 17020 except to change it to final plan and tweak a lot of the smaller things that we talked about before about changing it from building official to the city planner and things like that. But from a work process or flow standpoint, it wouldn't change all that much for final plan.
And this is also the section we'd add, these are the the criteria for a final plan, like we do in preliminary plan, we'd have a listing
Right.
of requirements. Back
Yeah,
to
so
Charlie's
standard
question. So you
requirements.
know what needs to be shown on a final plan. Like any of the signature notes and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So the next slide, I'm going to have you jump forward. Okay, this slide's good, Janelle, thank you. We're going to switch now to the design standards and guidelines. I mentioned that we've been working on these quite a bit between Charlie and his staff and us. We've been sharing these draft standards and talking about the format, which we talked about. There's, for each group, there'll be an intent, and then there'll be standards. They're usually measurable. They're required to meet them. Guidelines are more of a, not aspirational, but a design criteria. It can't always be measured, and they're usually qualified by you should be doing this. The only requirement is that the applicants demonstrated or provides feedback on their evaluation of the guidelines. So this chart's showing how they're grouped. So we've grouped them into categories. Many of them are the same group types. So streets were in there before, and electric utility and sewer. There's some new ones in here, site suitability, and what's another one? Maybe lot layout. They were addressed somewhat in the standards, but we're kind of categorizing them a little bit different in this. The stars are indicating the drafts are already prepared for those, and we're going to review those with the subcommittee moving forward. So Charlie, do you want to start on, I guess, the water and sewer, the three at the top?
Yeah, sure. Sorry I got those out to everybody just yesterday, but, you know, when I first started out, it was pretty much just working with the existing code section and putting it into the new format with the intent standards and guidelines. So I've done that. I really want everybody's look-see, though. And I know you guys will come up with some thoughts on what, especially the intent section, maybe the guidelines, which, like I said before, there's not many things under guidelines. The standards, please look them over. I've got a really good handle on those, just, you know, because that's sort of my expertise. But definitely take a look at them. I've added some things into these standards that should have been in there that haven't been in there. But again, I refer to various references, the Board of Public Works standards and in terms of water and sewer and their electrical standards that need to be looked at and probably updated some. And that's true for water, sewer, and electric.
So just for everybody, we don't have those on the screen at the moment. They will be on the website later today or tomorrow, but they were emailed to the committee members yesterday.
I will say that every time I look at them, I find something else I want to add or delete or change. So I'll continue to do so. But if you guys have feedback, just, you know, give it to me and I'll massage these some. I think they're in pretty good shape, definitely, generally.
So the process was to take the new format, take what's in the current code, plug that into it, and then with your experience and
Yes.
knowledge is to add things to it. So you've come up with water and sewer and electric so far.
Yeah.
So you've added an intent statement. A lot of the details from the current code are in there. And then, as you said, we've taken a stab at guidelines.
Yeah.
I know these ones are pretty detailed standards. Is there anything in your mind that you've seen that you needed to add to water that wasn't there that's pretty significant?
No.
Out of the current code? Okay.
No, the only thing that I am wrestling with a little bit is that one highlighted section for pump stations, and that's why I highlighted that, but I forgot to put it in my email, that's why I did that, is that I might want to add a little bit to that section. There's so many different pieces to a pump station, I can't add it all. It's got to be in the board standards, but I probably will want to add some things. The last thing I would want to, oh, go ahead, Janelle, I'm sorry.
Will there be some? Would it be something that you would want to like reference, just a general standard or like best engineering practices? Like if it's not specifically called out, that gives you the ability to use that? I mean, I'm just trying to think if we miss something, is it just like, oh, do we default to the best engineering standard as approved by the city engineer? Or don't you want that power?
No, I do, because I put that in my proposals to the city and the board that we'll review it against generally accepted engineering principles, so that's fine.
I haven't read them all yet.
I can put that probably in here somewhere, for sure, yeah.
If that makes,
I do cover it a little bit by saying like, and all appurtenances, because nobody knows what that word means, but it means everything else that might be part of the system. I don't know if this was right or wrong, Tom and Janelle, but when I was doing the intent statements, it was more from a sort of like what we were talking about before for stormwater, the holistic planning approach. Like this is, it's one thing for every lot to have Board of Public Works, water and sewer and electric service run to it. But it's another thing to think about, well, you might have to upsize your pipes because your development's here and the board service area extends beyond this, and we want to plan for that. So I kind of, when you're reading this, I had that in mind, that sort of holistic planning, and I thought that fit good into the intent section. Because it's not a standard, but it's, the intent, yeah.
and it's something that you're going to be looking at as you review the plan to make sure that the site is adequately served.
Yeah.
Don't dead end, a fire line.
Yes.
Loop the water system,
Sort of to Mr. Richards' point earlier is that, we have water models and sewer models for the entire Board of Public Works system so that we can plug in these new developments and see what it will do to the overall water and sewer systems.
Can I speak to that for a second? Quickly, Jack?
John?
I
As long
feel-
as you state your name for the record.
Sure, Tim Richard, Harborview Road. I failed to mention this aspect of that subject, and that is the kind of development that we're speaking about is obviously development that, for the most part, is going to be located in areas that would be subject to being annexed into the city. And the question I have is that if those adjacent parcels are in the county and have been reviewed by a different government agency, and are being managed by a different government, that is the county, Sussex County versus the city, do we still have the same assurances that you described, that the holistic, someone is looking at it holistically, the development
In terms of water and sewer?
Correct.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. A good example is the new development out on New Road, the
Right.
290-unit development. It's all set up for all the future development out on New Road.
Right.
For water and sewer, but not,
for water and
not
sewer.
other things, yeah.
Right. And, yeah, okay, thank you.
Yep.
So the other part about the intent statement to your question, Charlie, is to try and introduce from a review standpoint what the applicant needs to look at early in the process at preliminary plans. So under this new process, they're not going to be held to meeting each standard that they would in final plan, but they need to be made aware of what do they need to address. So that, I think it's a temporal thing of the intent is something that they would look at, and Planning Commission's going to look at, and City Council's going to look at, do they understand this is the intent, that you may not have done all the engineering yet, but you need to come back in final plan satisfying these intents. They can look at the standards which are in Article 4. They come after, they're not part of the review process. So we're consolidating them there. They're not going to be, a plan's not approved because they haven't met a standard, but we want to inform them of the intent statements. So they're going to be reviewed during preliminary plan. So I don't know if that helps with phrasing it. That's how, when I was doing them, I was trying to think of it. All these detailed standards later on, how do you capture for someone who needs to know what they're going to be, what the expectations are? How do you capture that in a paragraph so that they're aware of it?
But are you talking about putting that in Article 3 then, under the process?
Right.
Yeah, okay.
So the Planning Commission review, we looked at, was it 170-19E? And I said all that, the 22 considerations will go by the wayside.
Yeah.
But what our thought is anyhow, is that the intent statements would get listed there. And that's
Okay.
what they're reviewing when they're looking at a preliminary plan.
No, I totally agree with that, which is all the more reason I'd like the committee to review those intent sections to see if you think of anything beyond, what I was just talking about, my holistic planning that I've inserted into those.
Yeah. And I think what's in 170-19E, the 22, they are a lot of intent statements, but they don't have enough framework to reference for if the Planning Commission was looking at it. I don't think they really had a connection to standards, even though we're not holding them to that yet.
Yeah.
It kind of gives an idea of, Mr. Applicant, Ms. Applicant, you don't need to do these yet, but here's the intent of what you need to, if your plan doesn't have it,
Yeah,
here's
because
what you need to address.
that's what I was thinking, why we call out, this is what's required for preliminary, to show how you're starting to meet those intents, and then the final is you are definitely meeting the intent, because you've met all of those standards.
Yeah, like a
Yeah.
concrete example is that a developer would want to know early on whether they're going to be required to upsize their water main to 12 inches versus 8, which would be fine for their development, but not fine for the overall service area. So they would want to know early on that they're going to be held to looking into that.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're gonna do with the preliminary, with the pre-application meeting, is kind of like start looking at some of that stuff.
Yeah.
So they get ahead of that, and then, so we're calling out like different requirements for preliminary and final, because there are, but, yeah, sorry.
And they've gotten pretty good and used to it because they understand that water systems and sewer systems need to be looped together to better function for the entire city. So they understand that. They don't fight back on that much at all.
Yeah, and if we give them like a checklist, this is what you have to have at preliminary, but by the way, there's some wiggle room here, but
Yeah,
by the way, your final includes all of this plus that, so,
yeah.
yeah. Are you guys okay with that?
Yeah.
We're kind of talking, and I'm like, I'm not hearing from
Well-
the subcommittee, so I'm like,
No.
let's bring it back to the subcommittee. How you guys feeling about this?
Yeah, I'm really relying on you guys with your expertise in this process because it is such an involved process. I mean, you with the engineering
Yeah.
aspect of it and the intent and being able to put it in there. So I'm really relying on you guys to bring us all this information so that we can understand it more holistically and guide you where we need to and where we feel we need to as well.
So are you guys liking the process of how we are starting to envision the subdivision code to start to look like, and the new processing, and how these sections are gonna, like, the sewer utility has an intent, and then the standards?
You're following exactly what we said from day one
Okay.
when we opened this task force, when we said we need to make this streamlined, we need to make it clear. And I pretty much knew going into this, a lot of this work was going to fall back on you guys, and we're going to do the best we can to support you and get the information you need and take that and make the decisions we feel we need to make. So I think as far as the process, I think we had a nice roadmap when we started, and I feel like we are moving along in that process.
Nancy likes it too.
Do you like it,
Yeah,
Nancy?
Yeah, I'm just nodding yes. I mean, I like the process. I think, as always, the devil will be in the details. So
Right.
once we have a full draft, I think we need to think through how every member of the committee reviews this to provide feedback on language and wording and things we might think are missing or things we think shouldn't be there, whatever. So we can get to kind of end of job finally, on this.
I'm thinking homework for you guys is everything we've sent yesterday and the day before. Review it, see what are we missing? Does it make sense? And then as we put different, like the environmental section together and the other sections, and we send those out. So then we can kind of like, our next meeting, take a couple of the sections and like, okay, what did we miss? And start thinking of like different guidelines. It's like, especially for, I think, the site design ones and the environmental ones where we're talking about landscaping and open space and street trees, start thinking of stuff that then, you know, we can start like, okay, what do we want to have? And then what do we want to encourage to have? So then we can put that together and then get that to the Parks and Rec Commission. You know, I think those, to me, those are the categories that are going to have the most guidelines, because you don't typically see that in water, sewer, and utility as guidelines, unless, you know, like burying the utilities for like overhead electric. That would be probably a good guideline if it's not a standard. I'm going to admit I don't have all your standards memorized entirely, so.
Yeah, and I think the challenge is to look at all of the standards and, you know, ask ourselves, if someone meets all of these standards, will that be meeting the overall intent?
Would that be a good application, basically?
Yes, yeah.
Like, is this gonna be what we want for the city?
Right, and remember, every property is unique and has its own characteristics. So, you know, a lot of like the engineering standards are just general, but I think that's where you guys can start picking those guidelines. It's like, these are the standards for site design, landscaping, environmental items that we want to have, and then recognize bigger picture. You've got guidelines and best management practice that you want to include that may fit, you know, this property, but won't fit that property. So I think it gives you guys some flexibility to you know, achieve the intent even more. And I think you have a question from the audience.
Okay.
This is, so this is kind of touching on what Tim brought up, which is obviously most of what we're talking about here, based on where Lewis is now and its progression, are going to be properties that would be annexed into the city. So I guess my question is around the coordination of when the pre-annexation hearing, you know, the committees and those kinds of meet, and how that fits with the review of the development to see if it's indeed a property that the city would want to annex. And we'll forget the issues about BPW and where you know, their permissions to hook up, but that's a question I had of how do you see those timelines marrying?
Well, I think when a request for annexation comes in, is you're looking back to the comprehensive plan. You're not really looking at the zoning code and the code requirements. You're looking at, does our comprehensive plan recognize this property as being something we had designated as to wanting to come to have welcoming into the city? And then what is the appropriate zoning? And then that's really where the big things start, is because you have to keep in the back of your head, it's like, okay, we want to welcome this property into the city, but what's the best zoning for that? And understanding that zoning, then all of those uses go into that zoning classification. So if you annex a property and realize it's like, oh, it should be this residential, then whatever those residential requirements, then it could be developed that way. Or if you recognize, you know, maybe it should be town center, and again, just throwing it out there because that can't happen, is that all of those uses in that zoning make sense for that property. You're not looking at like, oh, this is how it's going to develop. You're looking at it like, for an annexation, I think you're looking at the 50,000 level, and then when the application comes back in, if we welcome it into the city, then we're looking at the 5,000 square foot level, the 5,000 foot level, and we're getting into those details. But the big thing is does it make sense land use wise, and does that zoning then make sense with what's going around that property? Am I off base?
No, I just want
Glenn?
to add to it, because
Yes.
this is something that's changed through the years in the city. So years ago, the city used to have a process that you could pursue annexation and subdivision at the same time. And it was changed. I just looked at 17013 now says, concerning areas outside the city limits, annexation shall be completed prior to the submission of a subdivision application under this chapter. So you can't even start to consider the subdivision application until the property's annexed. And I think the question.
Well, that's my question, is should we consider
Right.
looking at again?
Right, that's what I think is an issue for this group, is should we
Yeah.
be find a way to contemporaneously consider those two issues.
So more homework for you guys. Should we consider that?
Well, I'd like to know, wasn't it
Until it goes red.
Aren't you in theater, John? Come on.
drama?
This is a lot of drama.
Wasn't it like that before?
So it was, and then at some point Glenn said, I don't know why it changed, but at some point
Why
it,
they changed it.
That was a practice, I think, actually. I don't think it was actually a change.
and,
That might be right, that might be
Yeah.
right, yeah.
It was-
and I can see positives and negatives for both sides, but that is something that I think the subcommittee can consider and make a recommendation to the planning commission, because again, planning commission will hold public hearings, and then make a recommendation to council, council will hold their own public hearing, and then make a final decision on all of this, all of the proposed changes. So we got a long way to go. But definitely homework for you guys to think about, like, do we want to do that? And then Glenn, is that something legally you can do? Or is that something, because I've never seen them done at the same time before. I've always seen them done separately.
Would you like an example? Tim Ritzert, Harborview Road. Do you want an example?
No, I'm good. I want them to think about it. I just want them to, let the subcommittee think about, if that makes sense or not.
Yeah, I think the subdivision process is a time-consuming process of engineering reviews and things like that. That can take time, and an annexation is usually it takes time, but it's not as involved of research. You're looking at taxes and number of units and things like that, but a subdivision process for approval can take quite a bit more time, and how to
And
marry those two is.
I can also see the concern if you don't annex the property, you've just done an entire subdivision that doesn't meet somebody's code.
Well,
I believe we have more if you so chair.
and I have questions about that, but
City Manager Anne Marie.
Oh, City Manager Anne Marie Townsend. My caution would be that if the annexation and subdivision are approved together, that subdivision could sunset, or the property could flip, and somebody could come in with a different land plan. So there's nothing saying that is ultimately what gets built. Once it's in and zoned, it's still in and zoned.
Right.
So while you may be able to do that, which I guess I've
I think
got
you can
questions
do
on,
it
but-
legally, but I think some of the problems you run into is, you start to end up having discussions with the developer about what zoning he's going to achieve, and, so you have to be really careful not to get into a contract zoning scenario, which is illegal in Delaware. If you start to make
Yeah,
deals
because-
with them, with him or her, that we're going to.
It's like, so we want this zoning, but we don't want this zoning, and you can do this, and yeah, I think,
Right.
yeah, I'm sorry, I'm agreeing with the attorney. So,
I think we could probably keep that in mind and
There we go.
quick.
I think we can keep that in mind for our next meeting. We should probably move to pick a date for
Yes, and so.
for that time.
Does the intent of, as we continue to move forward and you guys review the sections we keep changing, so we can start discussing them at the next meeting, and then we can start pulling this all back into one. So when you eventually see it, we're gonna strike through the majority of 170, and we're gonna replace it new. But it's just gonna be cleaner. Right, Tom?
Right.
Because otherwise we're taking in, so, but we're gonna eventually get there. So yeah, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Let's take a look at the
I'd
calendar.
say the timing should be based on what we want to try and do in the next
Yeah.
2 to 3 weeks. So we have more standards to write. And what we're hoping for is you guys have a chance to look through those standards and give us feedback on, because we are getting into the details, as Nancy said, with these. They're, as you look through them, you can see quite a bit, and quite a bit of topics that are covered. If you notice, the ones I put together, the new parts are underlined, and when you look at lighting and landscaping, it's almost all underlined.
I noticed that.
So there's quite a bit of new things. What I would say to you is, we as your support team are trying to give you everything we think could work for Lewis. But what we're counting on is your feedback of, yes, these are good, those might be something we put aside for now, or things like that.
or that's too much, that should be a guideline, or like, no, these guidelines you want. So like, if you think of standards or guidelines, just email us back. Don't have a conversation in the emails, please. Because that way then we can take those comments, make those changes, get them back to you guys, and then we can make sure, because everything right now will be going on the website. It's been a busy week this week.
So we can talk to you but not each other?
You can, once you review your comments, just send them back to everybody. Then everybody has the comments. Staff will go through them. Just don't start like, Joe, you send comments and then John starts commenting on your comments and then Nancy starts, like, don't do that. That's what today is for. But please, once you make your comments, you can either reply back to the three of us, Tom, myself, and Charlie, or Glenn, the four of us, or just reply back to all, but don't discuss the comments. Okay?
What time frame do you need comments in so that at our next meeting, we can have some kind of consolidated view of the comments that have come in? Because it takes some time to, pull those all together.
So would you like a week or 2 weeks to review? And then, so what do you think about August 5th, which is 3 weeks for a meeting? And that gives you next week to get everything, you got a week to review. Is that enough time? And then a week for us to double check and then meet the next week? Or do you guys want a little bit more time?
I just know I'll be on vacation for part of that time. Maybe the following week would be better for me.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that then way if we go, okay, you have to have comments to us by August 30th, you guys get 2 weeks, just in case we need to get anything else out. July 30th, sorry. Sorry.
That's what I meant, August 30th.
And then we meet the week of the 9th, and you can pick any day of the 9th. I need to get my calendars up, so we'll be meeting again in a month. That way, okay, everybody needs to get comments back to us by July 30th. Then we've got 2 weeks, about a week and a half to get everything back. What do you guys think about that? Does that work?
I think that would work for me. That work for you?
Yeah.
Nancy?
Yes, that works for me too. And you
We haven't
mentioned
figured
that
that out.
things were underlined. I mean, in the ones that we received, the sewer, electric, and water.
They're not
When I
underlined. Yeah, that group's not underlined, but I think as Charlie mentioned, it's almost all, except for the intent statement.
Well, no,
And
I
there are-
didn't
there are some
underline,
things
I
that
did
are
not underline
highlighted
new
in
stuff.
yellow. I wasn't sure what.
It's mostly new, right?
Like
No,
pump-
it's a
pump
combination,
stations
new
and
and old.
force mains are highlighted in yellow.
Yeah, the pump station part of it was what I was talking about before, just, I need to flesh that out a little bit more, Nancy.
Okay. Oh,
So-
that's what that.
then that's
okay.
why I highlighted, so I
remember you
wouldn't forget
mentioning
it.
that, Yes.
Okay, so we have the week of starting Monday the 9th. What day works for you guys and what time?
About that Monday.
Monday.
Isn't that city council?
I think so.
At night, but if we do
Meet
like a
during the
1
day.
o'clock?
I could do 1 o'clock.
I will be in Rehoboth, well, I have Rehoboth City Council that morning, but they're done by about 1, so. Let's do it from there.
2 o'clock?
Yep. Yeah, that'd be a full day.
Just kicking out the citywide staff meeting. Sorry, Anne Marie.
So the 9th.
She hasn't
at
come.
2, is that right?
It looks like Monday the 9th at 2, and,
Tuesday,
oh, sorry, that was Tuesday, so, yeah, no, we're good, Monday the 9th at 2.
yeah, mitigation, Tuesday.
Works for me.
All right, I will get that on the agenda.
Well, I'd like to thank you all very much for participating. Thanks for coming by. And thank you very much, staff, for all the hard work. Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you.
Hit the gavel. Close the meeting.
Heard that.
Yes.
Recording stopped.